Well, sometimes things with neighbors can get a little bit tense.
Oh, yeah.
And that's definitely the case when we're looking at the U.S. and Canada right now.
Yeah.
Now, it's gone a little bit beyond just, chatting over the fence.
Right.
We're diving into some pretty deep waters with this trade escalation that's happening, particularly these new U.S. tariffs that are hitting Canadian steel and aluminum.
Absolutely. And it's not just a little tiny thing. It's a real ramping up of trade friction. And what we've done for this deep dive is we've pulled in a bunch of sources to give us the full picture. We're talking everything from just the latest news, breaking down each development as it's happening, to analysis, trying to understand the larger strategy, and timelines to see just how quickly this is all unfolded.
Yeah, the goal here is to make sure that you understand what's happening, why we've seen this sudden spike in tensions, and what the potential fallout is.
Yeah.
We're extracting the critical nuggets of information so you can grasp what's going on without getting bogged down in the weeds.
So let's jump right in and start with what really sparked this most recent round of tariffs.
Yeah.
What was that initial trigger?
Well, the spark seems to be Premier Doug Ford of Ontario.
Okay.
His move on Monday, March 10th, when he implemented a 25% surcharge on electricity exports going to the U.S.
Okay.
To a few states, actually, New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. So it might have seemed like, this is just an energy issue.
Right. Often we see how these things can have really big consequences.
Yeah.
So the very next day, on Tuesday, March 11th, President Trump responds.
And responds pretty strongly.
Yeah.
I mean, as significant as kind of putting it lightly, he didn't just mirror that 25% surcharge, he doubled down.
He did.
So he announced an additional 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum. And, we have to remember there was already a 25% tariff
in place
on these metals.
Right.
So that brings us to a pretty hefty 50% total.
A big jump.
Huge.
Yeah, and just the speed of this is pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
So he makes this announcement on Truth Social, and he says these tariffs are going into effect tomorrow morning, March 12th. So that's really fast.
Really fast.
So it begs the question.
Yeah, what's the reasoning? What are we hearing?
Yeah, what's the narrative?
What's the U.S. administration saying?
Well, the justifications we're getting from President Trump really align with a lot of what we've been hearing,
Okay.
It's all about protecting American industry.
Yeah.
He's accusing Canada of unfair trade practices.
Yeah.
Which, again, is a familiar line.
Yeah.
He even says in a statement, for too long, our great workers have been taken advantage of by foreign governments putting their interests first. This stops now. So it's really just a continuation of this America First trade policy.
Okay, but there's got to be more to it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this electricity surcharge, but then we're also seeing reports about allegations of drug trafficking.
Right, and that's where this gets a little more complicated.
Yeah.
Okay.
It seems that Trump actually started putting some tariffs in place the week before, based on claims that Canada was a big source of drugs coming into the U.S. with a big focus on fentanyl.
Right.
But if you actually look at the data from U.S. Customs and Border Protection, it tells a very different story.
Interesting.
It shows that since September, less than 1% of seized fentanyl has come from the Canadian border.
Wow.
And most of it was caught along the southern border with Mexico.
So like the opposite of what?
Yeah, so the data doesn't really line up
Right.
with the reason given for these earlier tariffs. And Prime Minister Trudeau actually called this initial drug-related tariff a dumb policy.
Okay.
So it really raises questions about, what's the real motivation here?
Right, so that's the U.S. side. How about Canada? How are they reacting to all this?
Oh, they are not happy.
Yeah.
I mean, as we said, Trudeau already said the earlier tariffs were dumb.
Right.
And they actually already put retaliatory measures in place. They put a 25% tariff on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods.
And there were also plans for tariffs on another $125 billion worth of American products.
Oh.
Just 21 days after the initial response. So the tension was already pretty high.
Yeah.
Premier Ford, who kind of started this whole thing with the electricity surcharge,
Right.
he also had some pretty strong words.
What did he say?
He called it economic warfare.
Oh.
And said Canada would look at everything they could do to fight back and protect their workers and industries. So the language is getting pretty heated.
Yeah, and we've got Mark Carney coming in as the new prime minister.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of talk about how he's going to handle all this.
Right. Well, people are saying he might put even more tariffs on U.S. goods.
Okay.
Especially in agriculture and automobiles.
Yeah.
Which are both really important to the U.S.
Right.
And to trade between the two countries. And it's interesting because Carney has said he doesn't want Canada to become part of the U.S.
which President Trump has suggested.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just about steel and aluminum.
No, not at all. Trump is demanding a lot more.
What?
He said he's going to put huge tariffs on cars coming in from Canada by April 2nd if they don't get rid of their tariffs.
Okay.
And he even said this would basically shut down the entire car industry in Canada.
That's a big deal.
It is, because the car industry is so connected.
Across North America.
Exactly. So it's a serious threat.
And what about dairy? Is that still a problem?
Oh, yeah. Trump is still pushing for Canada to get rid of its tariffs on American dairy farmers.
That seems to be a recurring theme.
It does.
And then there's that really interesting idea that keeps coming up about Canada just becoming part of the U.S.
Right.
The 51st state.
It's a wild idea.
It is.
But Trump has talked about it again.
What's he saying?
He talks about getting rid of the border and how Canada would be a great and powerful state. And even said they could keep their anthem.
It's a very different way of looking at trade.
Definitely.
So what has been the immediate impact of all this? I know we've seen some market reactions.
Oh, yeah. The stock markets did not like this news.
Yeah.
The Dow Jones dropped almost 600 points.
Wow.
And the S&P 500 also went down.
Not good.
It shows how worried investors are about a trade war and what it could mean for the economy.
Yeah, and are there any longer-term concerns that people are talking about?
Well, Mark Zandi, who's the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, he's worried that Trump's trade policies might actually cause a recession.
Oh, wow.
He calls it a recession by design.
Interesting.
The idea is that these tariffs will mess up supply chains, make things more expensive for businesses.
Right.
And then eventually prices will go up for consumers.
So everybody loses.
Pretty much. And for Canada specifically, these tariffs on steel and aluminum are going to hurt their producers a lot.
Yeah.
And then on the U.S. side, manufacturers might have to pay more for those metals, which would kind of cancel out any advantage for the U.S. steel and aluminum companies.
So it's really complicated.
Very complicated.
So let's go back and look at the timeline here, just to really see how quickly things have escalated just in March of 2025.
Right. Well, it all starts at the end of February with Trump saying Canada is trafficking drugs.
Right.
Which wasn't really true. And we have to remember they almost had a big trade war just a month before that.
Right.
Then last week, Trump puts the first 25% tariffs in place and Canada hits back with their own tariffs. Then this Monday, March 10th, we get the electricity surcharge from Ontario.
Right.
And just yesterday, Tuesday, March 11th, Trump announces he's doubling the tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum.
Wow.
And those go into effect tomorrow, March 12th.
Yeah.
And then looming over all of this is the threat of huge tariffs on Canadian cars coming on April 2nd.
So a lot has happened in a very short time. And what about the political side of all this? How does that play into everything?
Oh, it's definitely a big factor.
Yeah.
Trump's whole stance on trade fits with his America First message,
right,
which a lot of people support. And he might be thinking about running for president again. So being tough on trade with Canada could make him look strong to his supporters. But a lot of people are also worried about the consequences for the relationship between the two countries and for the economy in general.
So just to sum up for everyone listening, we've seen a huge increase in trade tensions between the U.S. and Canada.
Yes.
This whole thing started with that electricity surcharge, but it's blown up into a big fight.
It really has.
With tariffs on steel, aluminum, and possibly cars.
Yeah.
And the reasons for all of this are all over the place.
Right.
We've got retaliation, accusations of unfair trade practices, and those claims about drug trafficking, which don't seem to be true.
Yeah.
And Canada isn't backing down. They're talking about their own tariffs. And the U.S. is making even bigger threats, like those tariffs on cars, and even suggesting that Canada should just become part of the U.S.
It's unprecedented.
It really is. And the stock markets are already reacting negatively.
Yeah.
And some experts are worried about a recession.
It's a lot to take in.
It is so... This situation makes us think about the big picture.
Right.
What does this mean for the future of the relationship between the U.S. and Canada?
Yeah.
Their economies are so connected.
Absolutely.
And they have a long history together.
Right.
And if they can't figure this out, what does that say about the future of global trade?
Yeah.
I mean, in a world that's so interconnected, can countries afford to be this combative? And what about the idea of national sovereignty?
Right.
If the U.S. is pressuring Canada to become a state, what does that mean for other countries?
It's a very interesting question.
It is.
And I think we need to look beyond the headlines here.
Yeah.
And think about the bigger implications for the global economy and for politics.
Because this could have a ripple effect.
Absolutely.
Around the world.
Yeah.
So much to think about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
For this deep dive into the U.S.-Canada trade war.
Until next time.
Stay informed.